This deposition is taking place via Zoom video conferencing.
Mr. Rowe?
What is Atkinson Baker? That's the court reporter? Okay, hang on.
The court reporter service is on twice. All right. Madam Court Reporter, can you swear in our witness?
Yeah. Mr. West, would you raise your right hand? Do you solemnly state, under penalty of perjury, that the evidence you shall give in this matter will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
This is case number 220, entitled My Channel versus West.
My name is Michael Popak. Can you hear me, Mr. West?
Yes.
Okay. I see that you're looking down at probably a device. Are you on your phone?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to ask as a ground rule that you not be on your phone during the exam. Can we agree to that?
Well, is that legally what it should be?
I'm not going to advise you as to the law. That's why your lawyers are here. But that is my ground rule for the deposition, consistent with California law, that you need to be present, focused on the examination and not on a device.
Due to my mental geniusness, in order to focus on this bullshit, I need to be on a phone.
Counsel, do you want to speak to your client before we continue?
I think, well, Kanye, in terms of, you can listen to the questions and answer them, right?
Okay, I get off the phone.
Okay, Mr. West, why have you donned a mask to start this deposition?
Because you don't have the right to see my face.
And is it your intention to wear that mask for the entire duration of your examination?
Perhaps.
Okay. So, counsel, we're going to take this up with the magistrate, but I'm not going to delay the examination. We'll do it at the break.
Kanye obviously had planned a stunt. He had that mask in his pocket. He was just looking for the appropriate moment during the deposition. I'm in for a ride. My goal was to stay on that Bronco as long as I could.
Could you state your name and address for the record, sir?
Kanye Omari West.
And your address, sir?
The world. I just got a divorce.
Yeah. The summer of 2020, the founders of my channel filed a lawsuit against Kanye West for $10 million. My channel was a technology company that would take any content that was filtered through it, identify that merchandise, price it, and allow the person to buy it all with a click.
It's called live stream shopping. It's already changing the way millions of people shop online.
Think of it like QVC for Gen Z. Home shopping with real-time chats and clickable links.
At the time, Kanye was very unhappy with his e-commerce platform, and he wanted something else. My channel were told to meet with Kanye at his house. My channel claimed they had a handshake deal with Kanye West in order to integrate that technology into his e-commerce platform, selling Yeezy and other Kanye-created products. The My Channel founders invested 10,000 people hours and at least a $7 million total investment into the partnership with Kanye West. They devoted themselves full-time to Kanye. But after months of trying to get paid for the work that they did, Kanye West was no longer returning their phone calls. We finally got a hold of his lawyers, and Kanye's law firm said that a partnership never existed between the parties because there wasn't a written agreement.
They took him at his word and never signed a formal deal. But I could understand why people get caught up in the world of Kanye. I've interviewed Kanye many times, and he's intense. Kanye has that X factor, can make you literally feel like you're the only person in the room.
But the law recognizes an oral contract in that scenario. He really left them with no other choice but to bring the lawsuit against him.
Let the record reflect that the witness has put a mask on. We see the writing on the wall of what's going to happen here. So I'm going to implore the lawyers to speak to their client about being cooperative with the deposition that he's been noticed for and he's under oath. Let's go back to the ground rules for this deposition. You prevailed with the magistrate to have it by Zoom, but I get the equivalent of an in-person deposition. Mr. West, do you understand, sir, that you're under oath as if you were in a court of law? Do you understand that, sir?
Yes.
I had done my research about Kanye before preparing to take his deposition, and I had known from other media reports that he would attack the person asking the questions, he'd be dismissive over the case. I expected the worst.
I almost borderline like being sued because it's the only time where I can be myself, because I sit in those depositions and it'd be hilarious.
Okay, I get off the phone.
I wanted him to start answering my questions, but we were also prepared for it to take a lot of different twists and turns, including him acting out or being abusive. And one of the things I needed to establish in the deposition at the very beginning is that there was an actual meeting in Kanye's house in Calabasas with my channel. And that was the start of an oral partnership that in this case is just as binding and just as enforceable as a written contract. Frankly, it happens all the time. That's why the law recognizes oral agreements.
You don't have the right to see my face.
Let's start again, Mr. West. Your home address is what?
I don't have a home.
So you don't have a physical address that you live in?
I don't want to say. You're going to have pops up there.
Mr. Rowe, do you want to talk to your client about answering my questions?
Well, to the extent this is relevant, I mean, I understand why you're asking it, but I don't think it's relevant to the proceedings. Obviously, you can reach him through me.
Are you instructing your witness not to answer the question? We're on question 3 in this deposition. Are you instructing him not to answer?
I'm not. I think he's answered it.
He has not provided an answer. Mr. West, where
I'm
do
not going to tell you where I stay. I'm not going to tell you where I stay. Are you crazy? You think I'm finna tell y'all where I stay? Y'all trying to stick me up with a bullshit, trying to stick me up for some paper? You think I'm finna tell you where I stay? Are you crazy?
So the reason that you're not...
I asked you a question. Are you crazy?
Mr. West, the way this works...
For the record, you didn't answer the question.
The way... Mr. West, this will go a lot better and without a lot of involvement.
What do you mean? It's going great for me. You just entered my movie.
And what movie is that, Mr. West?
Mine, I just told you.
What is the nature of the movie that I've now entered?
I just told you. Next question.
Is the nature of the movie that you're not going to respond to questions when asked?
Are you not going to respond? Are you crazy? Do you think it makes sense for me to give the address to somebody who's already trying to rob me? Are you crazy?
So at this point, I want to catalog his outbursts so I have a clear record for the judge.
Madam Court Reporter, mark the record here.
I can use the video for sanctions.
For the record, you didn't answer the question.
Are you
crazy?
We would do it all again under court order at his expense.
Next question.
On our terms, live and in person, it would give us tremendous leverage over Kanye West.
Okay, where are you currently giving the deposition from? Where is that room?
I'm not going to tell you. You're never going to see me again.
Madam Court Reporter, same thing. Mark the transcript. And who is in the room with you, if anyone?
No one's in this actual room with me.
Okay. And what other things do you have in the room besides the phone that you've identified?
Are you stupid? I'm not going to tell you other things. I don't have the time to be talking about. I got a chair in the room. You are talking to the richest black person in the history of America. You're talking to a black Trump supporter, bro. Out of here. Don't ask me no stupid shit. Ask me the stuff where y'all trying to get the paper from. Ask me what's in this room. Quit wasting your client's money.
All right, Mr. West, I'm going to give you the logistics and the ground rules for this deposition now that
You're not giving me nothing. I don't care about you.
Counsel,
You're not giving me nothing. You can't give me nothing.
Counsel,
are you crazy?
Okay, Kanye.
I'm going to ask that counsel for Mr. West offline speak to their client about his conduct.
No, you can't ask me for nothing, boy. You can't ask him to do nothing, boy. He worked for me, boy.
Everything that's happening here is perfect fodder for me in front of a jury.
You can't ask me for nothing, boy.
How he acted comported with the way that he acted towards our clients. It was a one-to-one correlation. He was erratic.
Are you crazy?
He ghosted our clients.
You trying to stick me up?
This is what led to the dispute.
Out of here.
His own lawyers abdicated their responsibility as officers of the court to keep him on the straight and narrow.
Are you stupid?
And I knew that would piss the judge off as well.
You can't tell my lawyer what to do. You work for me, boy.
Mr. West,
This is a gift to my clients and to the case.
because where we're going to end up with this, Mr. Rowe, is where we're going to end up with this.
So Michael, why don't you
I
give,
love it. I want it. I want all the smoke. However you want it, boy.
Michael, why don't you
Y'all
give your
trying to stick me up? You trying to stick me up? People coming talking about the name of Christ. You know what I'm saying? They're trying to stick me up. Boy, you crazy?
Mr. Rowe?
I live for this.
Mr.
I
Rowe?
live for this, boy. You ain't finna have, I ain't finna get pulled over and you asking me to show my ID, ask me to tell you where I'm at, boy. You crazy? Answer my question.
Mr. West, are you incapable?
Answer my question. You thought you could do this to Kanye West? Listen to my name, boy. You know who I am? Listen to my name, boy. Your clients, y'all all crazy.
Mr. West,
y'all all crazy. It's not going to work, boy. God on my side.
This was a case my channel was forced to bring. They're out $7 million. They've abandoned all of their clients, and that Kanye had basically ghosted them. Kanye's law firm said, you got it wrong. A partnership never existed. Where's your contract? And then Sunday service happened.
Kanye West launches Sunday service. It's his weekly gospel service. It's an hour of singing. The choir's wearing Yeezy gear. And then Kanye started live streaming it.
He launched Sunday service with a major e-commerce component that looked suspiciously like the My Channel technology.
Then Kanye said that Sunday service was doing $1 million a night in Yeezy gear merch sales.
We believe he was using their technology in violation of the terms of that oral agreement. That was the basis for the lawsuit that we had filed.
Listen to my name, boy. You know who I am?
Mr. Rowe, what would you like to do next?
Michael, you can proceed. Proceed with your admonition.
Proceed with my admonition? Okay, so you're not going to, I just want to make sure we're clear for the record.
I was very shocked. He wants me to discipline Kanye. I felt his own lawyers were scared of him.
I'm free. I'm free.
They had lost control of their own client.
I'm
Mr.
free.
West, you're not answering my questions. Ekwan, you're going to be
You can't tell my lawyer what to do. You work for me, boy.
Mr. West, if you're going to continue to have outbursts and be disruptive.
What you mean outbursts? This is where I talk.
I am
It's an
sure
outburst for you to ask. It's an outburst for you to ask a Mensa level genius multi-billionaire what the hell is in a room with me. Don't disrespect me. I got things to do for the planet. I got people to heal. I got diets to change. I got no time for this.
I'm also
Y'all sticking me up.
Mr. West, if you're done with your outbursts, I can come back to
If you're done with your outbursts, everything you say is like an outburst to me because you're trying to stick me up. Are you crazy? Are you crazy?
When a witness like Kanye is acting out this way, there's a balance that I'm trying to strike. I am trying to get under his skin.
Mr. West, this is not your show. This is my deposition.
What you mean? This is my show. This is my movie. Everything my show. Everywhere I go, my show.
But I still want to get the exam. I still need his testimony. And so I'm trying to find if there's that moment, that inflection point where he calms down and starts answering questions.
Do you know who you talking to? I'm free. You're not talking to a slave mentality black man. You're an older white gentleman. You wouldn't know the half how to talk to a free man.
Mr. Rowe.
I'm free. I'm free. I'm free.
Mr. West, are you incapable or unwilling to give an examination today?
What do you mean? This is you examiner, right?
No, you're not
You
answering
see it,
my
right?
questions. You're not answering my questions.
I'm not going to tell you what's in a room with me. I'm not going to answer no dumbass.
Michael, why don't you start with your next question?
Why don't you start with something that makes sense, boy?
No, I'm not. No, Mr. Rowe, I'm going to do my examination in my way. I've asked the witness what materials he has in the room because I don't have the ability to have had this deposition in person, which we required and requested. I get to know what he has next to him in terms of materials. I get to know what technology he has that may be assisting him during the deposition. Let's go back. Let's see if we can get.
I made a calculated risk at that point that I had to establish dominance and that I was in charge.
So I return to my question, Mr. West. What do you have in the room in terms of materials that are in front of you during my deposition? Besides your hat, you have to answer aloud for the court reporter.
What does that hat say?
You can tell the court reporter what the hat says, sir.
So wait a second. You ain't gonna answer none of my questions. I only answer yours.
No, this is my deposition. You're under oath, sir, under penalty of perjury, not me. Madam Court Reporter, read back the pending question.
What do you have in the room in terms of materials that are in front of you during my deposition besides your hat?
I'm not gonna answer that.
You refuse to answer my question, sir?
I refuse to answer the question of what I have in the room because it's a dumbass question.
Okay, Madam Court Reporter, mark the record. And for the lawyers on this phone call, to the extent that your client continues to waste my 7 hours of allotted time, we will require him to come back and give his deposition again.
What's going to happen to me? I'm going to go to jail?
Only answer my question, sir.
No, I'm asking. Equan, can I go to jail off of anything related to this lawsuit?
You're not here to ask questions, sir. You're here to answer.
What you mean I can't ask my lawyer a question? You crazy?
No, you can.
You don't know who you talking to. I'm not some slave of yours, boy.
If you would
what
like,
you mean I can't ask my lawyer a question? That's the dumbest. Are you crazy? You just told me I can't ask my lawyer a question.
Mr. West.
No.
Michael, hang on, Michael. So, Kanye, if all we're doing is answering questions today, we'll be just fine.
All right, Mr. Rowe, that's your counsel for your client based on his outburst. Mark the record.
Hey, wait a second. Don't call what I'm doing an outburst. You hear me?
Well, so far, Mr. West, you've called me boy about a dozen times. You've cursed throughout this deposition, and you've refused to answer questions. So I don't know any other way to frame it.
It is a frame, isn't it? You finally said something that made sense.
He is never going to answer a question from me during this deposition. So now let's just make it all about the video that I'm going to use in front of the jury.
What do you mean I can't ask my lawyer a question? Are you stupid?
He actually took the stand at trial with a suit and tie and act like the calm, cool, and collected Kanye. I get to play this video.
You thought you could do this to Kanye West? Y'all all crazy.
Mr. West.
And that will destroy credibility and authenticity with the jury. A jury can smell a fraud a mile away.
Let's go back. Let's see if we can get through this examination over the next 7 hours. We have 7 hours of time together, exclusive of breaks. But I'm letting you know now, if this is a wasted time because you don't answer the question, we've lost the witness. Mr. Rowe, we've lost your witness on video.
I can tell.
All right, Equan, I'm going to take a break so that the lawyers can talk to their client, and I mean Mr. West.
All right, let me try to find it.
And just let the record reflect we didn't lose the witness. He shut off his video and he shut off his computer.
I'm going to take a 5-minute break in order to try to collect on our side what we're going to do next.
He never came back to the deposition.
I got people to heal. I got diets to change.
There is no world in which what he just did doesn't benefit my client and our case.
That's the dumbest Are you crazy?
If he goes to a jury trial, the jury would find, ultimately in our favor, this is a win.
No.
I think this was all mapped out like in a sketchbook in his mind.
What does that hat say?
About how this was going to go.
No, you can't ask me for nothing, boy.
This is a show. He thinks that we're all just players in a giant movie created by Kanye West.
You just entered my movie.
And he was in for a rude awakening.
This is not your show. This is my deposition.
You crazy?
Ultimately, the parties settled amicably. The deposition was the most important development in the case, demonstrating to both Kanye and his lawyers, we can't take this case to a jury in LA with Kanye acting like this. The terms of the settlement negotiated between the parties is confidential, but the My Channel founders are satisfied with the result, and they both moved on. And justice was ultimately done.
Kanye West certainly thought because he was a celebrity, the rules of regular people don't apply to him. He also used that power to trample on a little company, probably never thinking that he'd be called into account and have to pay the price.
Kanye assumed the My Channel founders were not going to fight back when he stole their technology. He knew that they were vulnerable. They could hold their heads up high because they held Kanye West accountable.
There is so much interest in this high-profile case between these two Hollywood megastars. Amber Heard is alleging that her ex-husband, actor Johnny Depp, was a drug-addicted abuser. All the while, Depp is saying Heard is lying about all of that.
These accusations destroyed Johnny's career and reputation, and did so in an instant. The stakes could not be higher. Johnny had to get his name back.
Your Honor, we call Mr. John C. Depp. Can you please tell the jury why you're here today?
About 6 years ago, Ms. Heard brought these disturbing criminal acts against me that were not based in any species of truth. I've never struck Ms. Heard. I've never struck a woman in my life. Nothing of the kind had ever happened. For me to come up here and spill the truth is quite exposing, but I know that I'm doing the right thing.
This trial was a huge deal. Johnny and Amber met on the set of The Rum Diary. They got married in 2015. But Amber filed for divorce after 15 months.
Both parties put out a joint statement saying, our relationship was tumultuous, but it was based in love.
In 2018, Amber Heard published an op-ed in the Washington Post suggesting that she was a victim of sexual violence in addition to physical violence 2 years earlier.
Now, she didn't mention Johnny Depp's name, but it's pretty obvious who she's talking about. And that's when there was all this speculation about Johnny Depp. Did he abuse Amber Heard?
The ramifications of this op-ed were immediate and devastating. Disney fired him from the next Pirates of the Caribbean movie. These accusations destroyed Johnny's career and reputation.
Johnny Depp claimed that he would never do the things that Amber Heard claimed he did. And he ultimately decided that he wanted to pursue a defamation claim against Ms. Heard. He was seeking $50 million in compensatory and punitive damages.
It became a huge frenzy. This was Johnny Depp and Amber Heard exposed, and you wanted to hang on to every single word that they both were saying.
Mr. Depp, I'd like to now turn to your relationship with Ms. Heard. Mr. Depp, have you ever physically assaulted Ms. Heard?
Never.
Have you ever sexually assaulted Ms. Heard?
Never. Certainly not.
What have you lost as a result of Ms. Heard making these allegations against you?
Nothing less than everything.
This case was he said, she said, and Johnny knew that he would have to show that she was not telling the truth, that he was the victim.
When did Ms. Heard's behavior towards you begin to change?
These little digs would escalate into a full-scale argument. Miss Heard, in her anger, she would strike out. She would. It could begin with a slap. It could begin with a shove. It could begin with, throwing a TV remote at my head. As it escalated, I removed myself from the situation so that it couldn't continue. I would just go and lock myself in the bathroom or anywhere that she couldn't get into.
Did there come a time when you and Miss Heard started recording your arguments?
Yes. She had completely denied things she'd said directly to my face. So I said, I'm going to record us. And I did.
I was hitting you. I was not punching you. Babe, you're not punched.
Don't tell me what it feels like to be punched.
You get punched. You got hit. I'm sorry I hit you like this, but I did not punch you. I did not deck you. I was hitting you. You're a baby.
And
you
physical
are
fights?
such a baby.
Because you start physical fights?
I did start a physical fight.
Yeah, you did, so I had to get the fuck out of there.
Those recordings confirmed that she would get violent with him. And his instinct is not to fight, but to run away and hide.
I'm sorry I hit you. I didn't mean to hit you.
We wanted to deconstruct major pieces of her narrative through her own words. What is this, a picture of Mr. Depp?
A wound from Miss Heard taking my cigarette, and she stubbed it out on my cheek.
What's reflected in this photograph?
Nailed me on the cheekbone.
What's reflected in this picture?
This was taken in the surgeon's office.
How did it come to be that your finger became injured?
She was banging on the doors and screaming obscenities and wanting to have a physical altercation. And so I was leaning like this in the chair. She threw the large bottle and it made contact and shattered everywhere. And then I looked down and realized that the tip of my finger had been severed.
Morning, Mr. Depp.
Morning, Mr. Rodenborn.
You would agree that you found drugs and alcohol at an early stage in your life?
Certainly, yes, I did.
And one of your good friends that you've taken drugs with before is Marilyn Manson, right?
Yes, we've drank together. We've had cocaine together maybe a couple of times.
Pills, right?
I once gave Marilyn Manson a pill so that he would stop talking so much. Sorry.
All right. I get it. And you would sometimes drink whiskey in the mornings too, right?
Isn't happy hour anytime?
Johnny's use of humor really undermined whatever serious point Amber's counsel was trying to make. We wanted to humanize Johnny before the jury so they could understand why hitting the woman he loved, it's something that he's just not capable of. But the one thing that we're concerned about is whether he might lose his temper. The other side is going to do everything possible to get Johnny to show anger.
Can you please bring up Defendant's Exhibit 638? Your Honor, move for the admission of this video into evidence.
What happened?
You want to see crazy? I'll give you. Where's crazy?
Oh, you're crazy. Oh, you're crazy.
Have you drunk this whole thing this morning?
Oh, you got this going. You got this going.
Just started it.
Oh, really? Really?
You would agree that you were violent in that clip, correct?
Clearly I was having a bad time. I did assault a couple of cabinets, but I did not touch Miss Heard.
You may have been drunk in that video, correct?
There's a possibility of that, yes, sir.
You poured yourself a mega pint of red wine, correct?
A mega pint?
Yeah.
I poured myself a large glass of wine.
Right.
I thought it necessary.
One of the things that lawyers try to do on cross-examination is to maintain control of the witness. And that's something that Johnny simply did not allow him to do.
Your Honor, we'd like to call Amber Heard to the stand.
For Amber's testimony, we were prepared for her to get up there and describe numerous incidents of alleged abuse.
He just hit me over and over and over again. And he's punching me with a closed fist, punching me, pounding the back of my head, pounding it with his fist. And I thought, this is how I die. He's gonna kill me now.
She said things that we knew we would be able to effectively disprove. We were going to argue that there was no evidence of physical injuries of the type that Amber described. We were looking forward to the cross-examination.
Be seated. Cross-examination.
We wanted to show the jury that Amber had a history of not telling the truth. If you can show that someone's not telling the truth about a few things, then it's not unreasonable for the jury to infer that the rest is not true.
Good afternoon, Miss Heard. Good afternoon.
Including that Miss Heard deliberately lied about donating all $7 million of the divorce settlement to charity.
Sitting here today, Ms. Heard, you still haven't donated the $7 million divorce settlement to charity. Isn't that right?
Incorrect. I pledged the entirety of the
Ms. Heard,
settlement, $7 million
that's not my
to
question.
charity, and I intend to
Ms.
fulfill
Heard,
those obligations.
Ms. Heard, that's not my question. Sitting here today, you have not donated the $7 million, donated, not pledged, donated the $7 million divorce settlement to charity.
I use pledge and donation synonymous with one another. They
But
do
I
the same
don't.
thing.
Ms. Heard, I don't use it synonymously. So as of today, you have not donated, paid $7 million of your divorce settlement to charity, right?
I have not been able to fulfill those obligations yet. I pledged the entirety.
But you didn't donate it.
Unfortunately,
you didn't donate it. It's a yes or no.
I haven't been able to fulfill those.
So that's a no,
obligations.
right, Ms. Heard?
I made the pledge. I want to be very clear. I pledged the entirety. I haven't been able to fulfill those pledges because I've been sued.
You had all of the $7 million for 13 months before Mr. Depp sued you, and you chose not to pay it to the charities you pledged it to. Is that correct, Ms.
I
Heard?
disagree with your characterization of that.
We hope the jury would realize that if this person is capable of lying about giving money to sick children, she's capable of lying about abuse.
Mr. Depp wears rings on every finger, doesn't he, Ms. Heard?
That's my experience, yes.
And they're not delicate rings, are they?
No, they are not.
You testified to an incident in March of 2013 where Mr. Depp hit you several times in the face wearing rings. Do you recall that?
That's correct.
You testified that this is a picture you took after that incident, right, Ms. Heard?
Yes, that was one where he grabbed me.
And hit you in the face so many times that you don't remember. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And there's no injuries to your face in this picture, are there?
Not that this picture shows.
Despite hitting you several times that you lost count with rings on his fingers.
That's correct.
In my opinion, there would have been not only serious injuries, but there would have been medical records. But there wasn't any medical records. That's why it was an incredibly difficult case to prove, because you are proving a negative. You are proving that no abuse ever happened. We could put on a perfect case and still lose this.
Ms. Heard, you testified yesterday that this is a photograph taken of you on May 21st, 2016.
Yes, that's correct. This is my face after Johnny threw a phone at it. My best friend took pictures of my face because the cops were coming.
If we could please do a split screen. You testified yesterday that the only difference between these two photographs is that the light was turned on.
That's what it appears to be, yes.
Isn't it true you just edited these photographs?
No, I've never edited a photograph.
Didn't you just enhance the saturation for one of these photos to make your face look more red?
No, that's incorrect. I didn't touch it.
You were sitting here in this courtroom when Officer Melissa Sines testified that she did not see any injuries on you that night, correct?
I heard her testify she did not consider this injured.
No. Officer Sines testified that she met with you and she did not see any injuries on your face. Officer Tyler Haddon also testified no injuries on your face on May 21, 2016. Isn't that correct?
They both said that they did not consider me injured.
You were also in this courtroom when Alejandro Romero, who worked at the front desk, testified that he didn't see any swelling or bruises on your face when you were talking to him at the front desk. Isn't that correct?
I know that's what he testified to, yes.
Can we please pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 356?
I can't promise you I won't get physical again. God, I sometimes get so mad I lose it.
Ms. Heard, that's you and Mr. Depp on that recording, correct?
That's correct.
And you told Mr. Depp, quote, "I can't promise you that I won't get physical," end quote. Correct?
That's correct.
And you also told Mr. Depp that sometimes you get so mad you lose it, correct?
That's correct.
You got physical with Mr. Depp often during your relationship, didn't you?
I had to defend myself as best I could. Didn't seem to make much of a difference.
You struck Mr. Depp multiple times during your relationship, didn't you, Ms. Heard?
There were many times I had to use my body to defend myself, and that included swinging wherever I could. If it meant I could get away, absolutely. You bet I would.
Since your testimony under oath that you never struck Mr. Depp as the initial aggressor?
I might be the first person to have been the first one to slap, but I wouldn't say I was the initial aggressor.
You just couldn't control yourself, could you, Ms. Heard?
I tried to defend myself when I could.
No further questions, Your Honor.
All right.
I understand we have a verdict.
We were all exhausted. Then the nervousness really set in. No matter how well you think the evidence has come in, it's always up to the jury.
As to the statement, I spoke up against sexual violence and faced our culture's wrath. Do you find that Mr. Depp has proven all the elements of defamation? Yes. As to the statement, then 2 years ago, I became a public figure representing domestic abuse. Do you find that Mr. Depp has proven all the elements of defamation? Yes. As to the statement, I had the rare vantage point of seeing in real time how institutions protect men accused of abuse. Do you find that Mr. Depp has proven all the elements of defamation? Answer, yes.
Ultimately, there was solid evidence that Amber Heard's version of what happened is demonstrably false. And the jury felt the same way.
All right, thank you.
Johnny Johnny was not with us when we learned of the verdict. He had a prior engagement, but we spoke to him afterwards.
He was elated, and he sounded as if the weight of the world was off of his shoulders. I mean, he sounded like a kid. He was thrilled. After the verdict, Johnny had no interest in bankrupting Amber, so ultimately it settled and she paid $1 million.
It's truly been a victory for Johnny Depp. He has appeared to completely bounce back. He's starring in movies again, and he was able to redeem himself and take back his reputation.
I admire Johnny tremendously. It's a victory for the truth.
The road stretches endlessly under a bruised Florida sky, a thin ribbon of asphalt cutting through scrubland and shadow. It is the kind of highway where headlights appear like distant ghosts long before the engine can be heard, where the silence feels heavy, almost watchful. On certain nights, the air hangs thick with humidity, pressing against the skin like something alive. And on those nights, if you had been driving alone, you might have noticed her. A figure on the shoulder of the road. A woman. Dirty blonde hair tangled by the wind. Clothes worn thin, clinging to a body hardened by survival. She stands just far enough from the pavement to be seen, but not enough to feel safe. One arm lifted slightly, not quite a wave, not quite a plea. Just enough to make a passing driver hesitate. That hesitation is everything. Because in that brief moment, when a man's foot hovers over the brake pedal, when curiosity or loneliness or desire flickers behind his eyes, something shifts. The darkness around the highway doesn't just sit there anymore. It leans in. It listens. And sometimes, it answers. The car slows. Gravel crunches beneath tires as it pulls to the side. The window rolls down halfway, cautious. A voice asks a question, maybe offering help, maybe something else. She steps closer now, her face still half hidden in shadow, her expression unreadable. There's something in her eyes, though. Not fear. Not exactly. Something colder. Something that has already decided how this moment will end. Hours later, sometimes days, the car will be found abandoned. Parked awkwardly in a clearing, or hidden just enough off the road to escape immediate notice. The driver will not be inside. Instead, somewhere deeper in the trees, beneath branches and insects and the indifferent weight of Florida soil, a body will lie still. A man who, just hours before, had been alive enough to make a choice. A man who thought he was in control. The first time it happens, it feels like an isolated tragedy. A robbery gone wrong. A violent encounter between strangers. The kind of story that flickers briefly across local headlines before being replaced by something else. But then it happens again. And again. Another body. Another man. Another stretch of road. Each one carries the same quiet signature. Close-range gunshots. Personal. Immediate. No struggle that lasts long enough to leave chaos behind. Just a sudden eruption of violence, followed by silence so complete it feels unnatural. And always, there are gaps. Missing items. A vehicle gone. A witness who remembers something vague, something fleeting. A woman, maybe. Or just the suggestion of one. At first, the pattern hides in plain sight. These roads are not unfamiliar with danger. Transient lives cross here all the time. Truck drivers, drifters, runaways, sex workers. People who pass through without leaving much behind. People who can disappear without setting off alarms right away. But patterns have a way of revealing themselves, even when no one is looking for them. A detective somewhere notices the similarities. The angle of the wounds. The way the bodies are positioned, as if the violence had been efficient, almost practiced. There is no frenzy here. No chaos. Just action, and then its aftermath. It doesn't feel random. It feels intentional. And that realization changes everything. Because random violence is terrifying, but it is also unpredictable, scattered, difficult to pin down. Intentional violence, on the other hand, suggests something far worse. It suggests a mind behind it. A person moving through the world with purpose, selecting moments, making decisions, refining methods. A predator. But not the kind anyone expected. Because when people imagine a serial killer, they picture something specific. A man, usually. Someone who blends into society by day and hunts by night. Someone who fits into a narrative that has been repeated so often it almost feels familiar. This case doesn't fit. The killer doesn't look like the stories people tell themselves to feel safe. She stands on the side of the road, asking for nothing more than a ride. And men stop. They always stop. What makes this story even more unsettling is not just the violence, but the contradiction at its core. The same person who will later be described as a monster, a cold-blooded murderer, is also someone who, at another time, might have been dismissed as invisible. A woman surviving on the margins. A life shaped by neglect, abuse, and abandonment. Someone easy to overlook. Someone easy to underestimate. That contradiction lingers in every detail of what follows. Because as the bodies begin to accumulate, and the investigation slowly tightens its focus, the question is no longer just who is responsible. It becomes something far more uncomfortable. Why? Why these men? Why this method? Why this pattern of approach, of intimacy followed by destruction? Why does each encounter seem to begin with vulnerability and end with absolute control? And perhaps most disturbing of all, how does someone move from one side of that equation to the other? The highways of Florida do not change. They remain what they have always been, long, empty stretches of road cutting through heat and shadow. Cars still pass through them every night, their headlights carving brief tunnels of light into the darkness. Drivers still make choices without thinking twice. To stop. To trust. To assume. But for a time, those roads carried something else. A presence that could not be seen until it was already too close. A story unfolding one encounter at a time, each one leaving behind just enough evidence to hint at something larger, something more deliberate, something that refused to stay buried. And at the center of it all is a name that would eventually become impossible to ignore. Aileen Wuornos. But at the beginning, she is just a silhouette on the roadside. A figure waiting in the dark. And the night, as always, is listening. Florida does not hide what it is. It announces itself in the heat that clings to your skin the moment you step outside, in the dense air that smells faintly of salt, gasoline, and something organic slowly breaking down beneath the surface. The highways cut through it all like scars, stretching across miles of scrubland, past motels with flickering neon signs, gas stations that never truly sleep, and patches of wilderness that seem untouched and indifferent to everything happening at their edges. It is a place of movement, of people passing through, of lives intersecting briefly and then disappearing again without explanation. In the late 1980s, these roads carried a particular kind of rhythm. Truckers pushing through long hauls, tourists chasing sunlight, locals navigating familiar routes with the quiet confidence of routine. But there was another layer beneath that rhythm, one that rarely made it into postcards or travel brochures. It existed in the margins, in the spaces between destinations, where survival often depended on improvisation rather than stability. This was the world that shaped Aileen Wuornos long before her name would ever be spoken in courtrooms or printed in headlines. To understand what would later unfold on those highways, you have to begin far away from them, in a life that never seemed to offer her a clear path forward. She was born into instability. Her father, a convicted sex offender, would never play a role in her upbringing, leaving behind only a shadow that lingered in the background of her story. Her mother abandoned her when she was still a child, leaving Aileen and her brother to be raised by grandparents who were, at best, ill-equipped and, at worst, actively harmful. The house she grew up in was not a place of safety. It was a place where violence simmered just beneath the surface, where affection was unpredictable, and where silence often replaced protection. By the time she reached adolescence, the idea of stability had already slipped out of reach. She learned early that survival meant adapting quickly, trusting rarely, and expecting little. At an age when most children are still forming their sense of identity, Eileen was already navigating a world that demanded resilience without offering guidance. There were reports of abuse, of exploitation, of moments that blurred the line between victim and survivor in ways that would leave lasting scars. She ran away more than once. Eventually, she stopped going back. The transition from a broken home to life on the road was not a single decision but a series of small steps, each one moving her further away from anything resembling permanence. She drifted between states, between temporary shelters and stretches of complete isolation. There were nights spent sleeping in abandoned cars, under bridges, or wherever she could find a moment of relative safety. Hunger was not an occasional discomfort but a constant presence, shaping her choices in ways that outsiders would later struggle to fully grasp. By the time she arrived in Florida, she was no longer searching for a way back to a conventional life. That door had closed quietly, without ceremony. Instead, she adapted to the environment she found herself in, one that operated by its own unspoken rules. Along the highways, there existed an economy of desperation. Transactions that were rarely discussed openly but understood by those who relied on them. For Eileen, prostitution became less of a choice and more of a continuation of the only pattern she had ever known, using what she had to survive another day. The men she encountered were as varied as the roads themselves. Some were passing through, looking for something fleeting and anonymous. Others were regulars, familiar with the rhythms of these encounters, comfortable in the knowledge that they would likely never see the same face twice unless they wanted to. There was an inherent imbalance in these interactions, one that favored those with money, with mobility, with the ability to leave whenever they chose. But over time, something began to shift. Florida's highways, with their endless stretches and hidden pockets of isolation, offered more than just opportunity for survival. They offered anonymity. They offered distance from scrutiny. And perhaps most importantly, they offered a kind of control that had been absent from Eileen's life for as long as she could remember. Control does not always arrive in obvious ways. Sometimes it begins as a feeling, subtle and unfamiliar. The realization that in a confined space, like the interior of a car, the dynamics can change quickly. That proximity can be both a vulnerability and a weapon. That the same isolation that makes someone a target can also make them dangerous. For most people, these thoughts remain abstract, fleeting. But for someone shaped by years of instability, of being acted upon rather than acting, the appeal of reversing that dynamic can be powerful. During this time, another presence entered Eileen's life, one that would later become central to the investigation. Tyria Moore was not like the men who passed through the highways. She represented something different, something closer to companionship, perhaps even a sense of belonging that Eileen had rarely experienced. Their relationship was complicated, marked by moments of connection and dependence, but it introduced a new layer to Eileen's already complex world. Together, they moved through Florida's transient spaces, sharing rooms when they could afford them, relying on each other in ways that blurred the lines between partnership and survival strategy. For Eileen, Tyria was both an anchor and a mirror, reflecting back a version of herself that was still capable of attachment, of loyalty, of something resembling normalcy. But even as that connection deepened, the underlying realities of their situation did not change. Money was still scarce. Stability was still elusive. And the highways continued to stretch out before them, offering the same opportunities and the same risks. It is important to understand that nothing about this environment was static. It was constantly shifting, shaped by the people moving through it, by the decisions made in moments of pressure, by the quiet accumulation of experiences that begin to alter perception over time. What might have started as survival can, under certain conditions, evolve into something else entirely. By the end of the 1980s, the stage had been set in ways that were not immediately visible to those outside this world. The highways were the same. The routines were familiar. The encounters followed patterns that had existed long before Eileen arrived. But within those patterns, something had changed. Eileen Wuornos was no longer just reacting to the world around her. She was beginning to shape it, in small, deliberate ways that would soon have consequences far beyond anything those passing through Florida's roads could have imagined. And somewhere along those endless stretches of asphalt, the line between survival and something far more dangerous was about to disappear. The men who would later be reduced to names in police reports and photographs on evidence boards did not begin as victims. They began as lives in motion, each one carrying its own history, its own routines, its own quiet assumptions about how a day would unfold and how it would end. They were not connected by friendship or family, not part of any shared circle that might have drawn attention more quickly. What connected them was far more fragile than that. A moment. A decision. A stretch of road where something ordinary shifted into something irreversible. The first to be identified was Richard Mallory, a man in his 50s who had spent much of his life navigating a world that had not always been kind to him. He had worked various jobs over the years, moving between places, carrying with him a past that included trouble with the law and a reputation that was, at best, complicated. But like many men who found themselves on Florida's highways, he existed in that gray space between stability and drift, where routines were loose and accountability was often distant. On the day he crossed paths with Eileen, nothing about his routine would have suggested that it would be his last. The road was just another road. The decision to stop was just another decision. There was no visible marker, no warning etched into the landscape that might have signaled the danger waiting at its edge. To anyone watching from a distance, it would have looked like an ordinary interaction. A car slowing. A door opening. Two people entering the same space for reasons that would never be fully known. What happened next would later be reconstructed through fragments. Forensic details. Ballistics. The position of the body when it was eventually discovered. He had been shot multiple times, the violence not chaotic but deliberate, controlled. There were no signs of a prolonged struggle, no evidence of a drawn-out confrontation. Just the abrupt end of a life, followed by silence. At first, there was nothing to connect his death to anything larger. A single case, isolated, filed away among others that shared similar ambiguities. But then another man disappeared. And another. Each of them carried their own story into those final moments. Some were family men, their lives structured around responsibilities waiting for them elsewhere. Others were more transient, accustomed to the anonymity of the road, to interactions that began and ended without leaving a trace. What they shared was not a common background, but a common vulnerability, the belief that the situation they were entering was manageable, predictable, within their control. One of the later victims, a middle-aged man traveling alone, had been seen at a gas station hours before his death. Security footage would eventually show him moving through the space with the casual ease of someone who had done it countless times before. He paid for fuel, exchanged a brief word with the cashier, and stepped back into the night without hesitation. If he noticed anything unusual, he did not show it. There was no urgency in his movements, no sense that anything was about to go wrong. Somewhere after that stop, he encountered her. Another man, younger, had spoken to a friend earlier that evening. The conversation was ordinary, filled with the kind of small details that rarely seem significant until they become the last recorded trace of someone's voice. He mentioned where he was heading, how long the drive might take, what he planned to do once he arrived. There was no fear in his tone, no hesitation. Just the assumption that the road ahead would lead him where he intended to go. It didn't. What makes these stories particularly unsettling is not just the violence that ended them, but the normalcy that preceded it. There was no single type of victim, no clear pattern that would have allowed someone to look at these men and predict what was coming. They were not chosen because of who they were in a broader sense. They were chosen because of where they were, and when. And because they stopped. In the aftermath of their deaths, investigators would search for connections, for any thread that might tie these men together in a way that made sense. They would look at their backgrounds, their habits, their last known movements. They would speak to family members who struggled to reconcile the person they knew with the circumstances of their death. They would piece together timelines that always seemed to end in the same way, a gap. A period of time where everything that mattered happened out of sight. For the families, the experience was disorienting in a different way. Grief is often accompanied by questions, but in these cases, the questions multiplied without answers. Why had he stopped? Who had he trusted in those final moments? Had there been a chance to escape, a moment where something might have gone differently? These were questions that lingered, unanswered, because the only person who could fully explain what happened in those confined spaces was the one who had survived them. And her explanations would change. In her version of events, the narrative shifted from one encounter to the next. She spoke of fear, of being threatened, of situations that escalated beyond her control. She described moments where the men she had encountered became dangerous, where the balance of power turned against her, forcing her to act. In these accounts, she was not the aggressor but the one reacting, the one pushed into a corner with no way out. But the physical evidence told a more complicated story. The number of shots fired. The consistency of the method. The absence of injuries that might support prolonged self-defense. And perhaps most telling, the disappearance of personal belongings, the use of vehicles that did not belong to her. These details suggested a pattern that extended beyond isolated acts of desperation. They suggested intention. For each victim, the final moments of their lives existed at the intersection of two conflicting narratives. One framed the encounter as a sudden escalation, a situation spiraling out of control. The other implied preparation, a familiarity with the process that comes only from repetition. Somewhere between those two possibilities lay the truth, obscured by time, by memory, and by the limitations of what could be proven. As the number of victims grew, the individual stories began to merge into something larger, something that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The highways that had once seemed like neutral ground now carried a different weight. Each stretch of road held the potential for another encounter, another decision that could not be undone. And yet, for the men who continued to travel those roads, nothing visibly changed. The gas stations remained open. The traffic continued to flow. The routines persisted, uninterrupted by the knowledge that somewhere within that familiar landscape, a pattern was forming. A pattern that would only become visible once it was too late for those who had already become part of it. Because for every victim, the story ends the same way, a moment of ordinary life giving way to something final and irreversible, leaving behind only fragments for others to piece together. And in those fragments, a portrait begins to emerge. Not just of the person responsible, but of the fragile line that separates control from vulnerability, assumption from reality, and survival from something far more permanent. By the time investigators began to fully grasp the scope of what was happening, the victims were no longer isolated cases. They were part of a sequence, each one echoing the last, each one pointing toward a presence that moved through the night with increasing certainty. And the roads, unchanged and indifferent, continued to carry the next potential encounter forward. It never begins with violence. Not in a way that can be easily recognized, not in a way that announces itself before it happens. It begins with something quieter, something that looks almost ordinary when viewed from the outside. A car slowing along the edge of a highway. A glance exchanged through glass and shadow. A decision made in seconds, shaped by instinct, habit, or desire. The kind of moment that happens countless times every night without consequence. But in these encounters, the ordinary becomes a doorway. The interior of a car is a confined world. Doors closed, windows half open, the outside fading into a blur of darkness and passing light. Conversations here are different. Shorter. More transactional. There is an unspoken understanding between two strangers who have agreed, however briefly, to share the same space. Names are not always exchanged. Histories remain hidden. What matters is the present moment, the negotiation of boundaries, the quiet assessment of risk. For the men who picked her up, there was a familiarity to this dynamic. Some had done it before, enough times that the tension had dulled into routine. Others approached it with caution, but still with the assumption that they were in control. After all, they were the ones driving. The ones deciding when to stop, when to leave, when to end the encounter. That assumption would not hold. With Eileen Warnos, the dynamic shifted in ways that were not immediately visible. She did not present herself as a threat. There was no overt signal, no sudden movement that would trigger alarm. Instead, there was a gradual tightening of the space, an invisible shift in control that happened not all at once, but in stages. It might begin with a change in tone, a hesitation, a look that lingered just a second too long. Something subtle enough to be dismissed, to be rationalized as part of the discomfort that often accompanies interactions between strangers. But beneath that surface, something else was taking shape. In her later accounts, Eileen would describe these moments as turning points, instances where the situation became dangerous for her, where the man beside her revealed an intent that forced her to act. She spoke of fear, of being cornered, of having no choice but to defend herself. These narratives painted the encounters as reactive, as sudden eruptions of violence driven by necessity. But the physical reality of what followed tells a story that is harder to reconcile with that version. The gun appears quickly. There is no prolonged struggle, no chaotic escalation. The shots are fired at close range, precise and controlled. In some cases, multiple rounds are discharged in rapid succession, leaving little room for resistance, little chance for the other person to respond. The violence is immediate, overwhelming, and final. Inside the car, there is no space to run. The aftermath is just as telling. The stillness that follows is not one of shock or confusion, but of transition. A shift from action to aftermath that happens with a kind of efficiency. The body is moved, sometimes dragged from the vehicle into the surrounding brush, hidden just enough to delay discovery but not always with the care one might expect from someone trying to erase all traces. It is not about perfection. It is about completion. Then comes the next step. The car, now empty of its original driver, becomes something else entirely. A resource. A means of movement, of escape, of continuation. Personal belongings are taken, not as trophies in the traditional sense, but as extensions of survival. Money, clothing, anything that can be used or traded or relied upon in the days that follow. The line between necessity and opportunism blurs, leaving behind a pattern that investigators would later struggle to categorize neatly. Each incident unfolds in isolation, separated by time and distance, but connected by method. The locations vary: wooded areas, side roads, places where the natural landscape provides just enough cover to obscure what has happened. The highways act as arteries, carrying both victim and perpetrator into these spaces before releasing them back into the flow of movement that defines the region. What makes these events particularly difficult to grasp is the absence of witnesses. Not because no one is present, but because the moments that matter happen out of sight. A passing car might see two figures on the side of the road, might notice a vehicle pulled over, might even register a vague sense that something is unusual. But by the time anything changes, by the time the situation crosses from ambiguous to undeniable, it is already too late. The violence does not announce itself. It arrives, completes its purpose, and disappears. For Eileen, each encounter becomes part of a sequence, one that seems to build on itself with each repetition. Whether driven by fear, by desperation, or by something more complex, the pattern solidifies. The act itself becomes familiar, the steps following it more defined. There is less hesitation, less uncertainty. The unknown gives way to something that resembles routine. But routine does not mean simplicity. Beneath the surface, there are contradictions that refuse to resolve. Moments where her own accounts shift, where the line between victim and aggressor blurs in ways that are deeply unsettling. If she is telling the truth, then each act of violence is rooted in a perceived threat, a response to danger that leaves her with no alternative. If she is not, then what emerges is something far more calculated, a deliberate use of circumstance to exert control in a world where she had once had none. Perhaps the most disturbing possibility lies somewhere in between. That the fear was real, but not always justified. That the threat was perceived, but not always present. That the violence, once initiated, became its own form of certainty, a way to eliminate ambiguity in situations that might otherwise spiral beyond control. In that sense, each incident is not just an act of survival or aggression, but an attempt to impose order on a world that had never offered it. For the victims, however, there is no such complexity in the outcome. Their stories end in the same way, regardless of the circumstances that led them there. A moment of decision followed by a sequence they cannot interrupt, cannot escape, cannot survive. The highways remain unchanged, indifferent to what happens along their edges. Cars continue to pass, headlights cutting through the darkness, each one carrying its own story, its own assumptions about the journey ahead. The landscape absorbs what it is given, holding onto it just long enough before releasing it back into the awareness of those who begin to notice the pattern forming. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the pattern begins to draw attention. Not because of any single event, but because of the accumulation. The repetition. The quiet realization that these are not isolated incidents, but chapters in a larger narrative that is still unfolding. A narrative that moves from one stretch of road to the next, from one encounter to another, leaving behind a trail that is just visible enough to follow. And at the center of it, a figure who steps into cars under the cover of night, carrying with her a story that is still being written, one encounter at a time. The first discovery does not feel like the beginning of a pattern. It feels like an interruption. A break in the expected rhythm of the landscape, something out of place just enough to draw attention, but not yet enough to suggest something larger hiding beneath it. In Florida, where dense brush swallows sound and sight with equal indifference, bodies are not always found quickly. Sometimes they are revealed by accident, by a hunter moving off a familiar trail, by a maintenance worker following a route that rarely changes, or by the slow, inevitable process of nature giving something back. In one case, the discovery begins with a smell. Not immediate, not overwhelming, but persistent. Something that does not belong in the open air, something that lingers long enough to prompt a closer look. The man who notices it hesitates before stepping off the path, his movements cautious, uncertain. There is always a moment before the truth becomes clear, a brief window where the mind searches for alternative explanations, for something less final. But there are certain sights that erase doubt instantly. The body lies partially concealed, as if the earth itself had attempted to reclaim it but stopped halfway. Clothing disheveled, skin marked by time and exposure, the stillness unmistakable. The position suggests it was not placed there with care, but with urgency, as if the act of leaving was more important than the act of hiding. The initial reaction is often the same, a step back, a sharp intake of breath, the sudden awareness of silence pressing in from all sides. Authorities are called. The area is cordoned off. And just like that, the isolation of the location becomes an advantage not for the one who committed the act, but for those now trying to understand it. Crime scene investigators move with a practiced rhythm, their presence methodical, controlled. They document everything. The position of the body, the surrounding vegetation, the condition of the ground beneath it. Photographs are taken from multiple angles, capturing details that might not seem significant in the moment but could later become crucial. The air feels heavier here, not just because of the heat, but because of the weight of what has happened. The wounds tell their own story. Close-range gunshots, the entry points clear, the damage precise. This is not a chaotic act of violence. There is no evidence of a prolonged struggle, no signs that the victim had time to fight back in any meaningful way. The conclusion begins to form even before the body is moved. This was quick, controlled, intentional. But intention alone is not enough to build a case. Nearby, the ground is disturbed in subtle ways. Footprints, partially obscured. Tire tracks that might belong to any number of vehicles that have passed through the area. Investigators mark them, measure them, document them, knowing that in isolation, each detail means very little. It is only when compared to something else, another scene, another set of marks, that they begin to carry weight. Personal belongings are notably absent. Wallet, identification, anything that might immediately confirm who this person was, gone. This creates a delay, a gap between discovery and identification that complicates the process. Without a name, the victim remains a question mark, a case without context. Eventually, that changes. Fingerprints, dental records, missing persons reports, one of these threads leads to an answer. A name is attached to the body, and with it, a life that extends beyond this isolated patch of land. Family members are notified. Questions begin to surface, not just about how this happened, but why. At this stage, the case still stands alone. But then another body is found. Different location, similar circumstances. Again, it is an accidental discovery, a moment where someone stumbles upon something they were never meant to see. The process repeats itself. The cordoned-off area, the investigators, the careful documentation. And once again, the details begin to align in ways that are difficult to ignore. Close-range gunshots. Minimal signs of struggle. Missing personal items. Individually, these elements could be explained in multiple ways. Together, they begin to suggest a pattern. As more discoveries are made, the sense of isolation that once defined each scene starts to erode. Investigators begin to compare notes, to look beyond the specifics of each case and focus on the similarities that connect them. The locations, while not identical, share certain characteristics. Secluded, but accessible. Close enough to major roads to allow for quick entry and exit, but far enough removed to delay discovery. The victims, too, present a pattern, though a subtle one. Adult men, varying in age and background, but united by circumstance. Each had been traveling alone. Each had last been seen in a context that involved movement, transition, the kind of situation where interactions with strangers are more likely. The realization does not arrive all at once. It builds slowly, piece by piece, as each new case adds another layer to the emerging picture. What once seemed like isolated incidents now appear connected, part of a sequence that is still unfolding. With that realization comes a shift in approach. Investigators begin to revisit earlier scenes, looking for details that might have been overlooked. Evidence is re-examined, timelines adjusted, witness statements reconsidered in light of new information. The focus narrows, moving away from the possibility of multiple unrelated perpetrators and toward the likelihood of a single individual moving through these spaces with purpose. There is a certain tension that comes with this shift. The knowledge that if there is a pattern, then there is also a continuation. That somewhere, beyond the scenes already discovered, there may be another event waiting to happen. Or already happened, but not yet found. The vehicles associated with the victims become a key point of interest. Some are recovered, abandoned in locations that do not immediately connect to where the bodies were found. Others remain missing for longer periods, creating gaps in the timeline that are difficult to fill. Each vehicle represents movement, a journey that did not end where it was supposed to. Witnesses begin to surface, though their accounts are often fragmented, uncertain. A man remembers seeing one of the victims speaking to a woman on the side of the road. Another recalls a similar interaction, but cannot be sure of the details. The descriptions are inconsistent, shaped by memory and perception, but they share just enough in common to draw attention. A woman. That detail lingers, not because it confirms anything, but because it challenges assumptions. It does not fit the typical profile investigators might expect. It introduces a level of ambiguity that complicates the narrative, forcing them to consider possibilities that might otherwise be dismissed. As the investigation deepens, the scenes themselves begin to feel less like isolated points and more like markers along a path. Each one contributes to a growing understanding, not just of what happened, but of how it happened. The consistency of the method, the choice of locations, the handling of the aftermath, all of it suggests a level of familiarity, of experience. This is not someone acting randomly. This is someone who has done this before. And may do it again. The discoveries, once rare and shocking, begin to take on a different tone. Not less disturbing, but more expected. Each new scene reinforces what investigators are beginning to suspect, tightening the pattern, reducing the space for alternative explanations. But even as the picture becomes clearer, there are still gaps. Missing pieces that prevent a full understanding of who is responsible and why. The evidence points in a direction, but it does not yet lead to a name. That will come later. For now, what remains are the scenes themselves. The quiet patches of land where lives ended, where the only witnesses are the trees, the soil, and the careful documentation left behind by those trying to make sense of it all. Places that, once discovered, can never return to what they were before. Because once you know what happened there, once you see the pattern that connects them, the landscape changes. It is no longer just a stretch of wilderness, a roadside clearing, a forgotten corner of the map. It becomes part of something larger. Something still moving. Something not yet finished. By the time investigators begin to accept that they are not dealing with isolated incidents, the case has already grown complicated in ways that are not immediately visible from the outside. Patterns may exist, but patterns alone do not lead to arrests. They raise questions, narrow possibilities, and create direction, but they do not provide certainty. And in this case, certainty remains just out of reach, hidden somewhere between incomplete evidence and unreliable human memory. The early stages of the investigation are defined by expansion rather than focus. Detectives cast a wide net, exploring multiple theories at once, each one plausible enough to justify time and resources. The victims, though connected by circumstance, do not share obvious personal links. They are not part of the same social circle, do not work together, do not frequent the same locations in any consistent way. This absence of connection makes it difficult to identify a clear motive or a predictable pattern of behavior. One theory suggests robbery as the primary driver. The missing belongings, the abandoned vehicles, the signs that items had been taken after each incident, all of this supports the idea that the perpetrator is motivated by necessity or opportunism. In this version of events, the violence is a means to an end, a way to remove resistance and secure resources. It is brutal, but it is also practical. Another theory leans toward something more personal, more psychological. The close-range nature of the shootings, the repetition of the method, the lack of hesitation implied by the evidence, all of this points toward someone who is not just acting out of need, but out of something deeper. Control, perhaps. Or anger. Or a need to assert dominance in situations where they might otherwise feel vulnerable. These theories do not cancel each other out. If anything, they overlap in ways that make the case more difficult to define. As investigators move forward, they begin to focus more closely on the victims' last known movements. Where were they before they disappeared? Who did they interact with? What choices did they make in those final hours? These questions lead them back to the highways, to the gas stations, to the motels and rest stops that form the backdrop of these encounters. Witnesses are located, but their accounts are fragmented. Memory is unreliable under normal circumstances, and these are not normal circumstances. People remember pieces, flashes of interaction that did not seem important at the time. A man talking to a woman near his car. A vehicle parked at an unusual angle. A figure walking along the shoulder of the road late at night. None of these details are definitive on their own, but together they begin to suggest a presence that moves through these spaces with a kind of consistency. A woman. That detail continues to surface, but it brings more confusion than clarity. Female perpetrators are statistically rare in cases like this, especially when the victims are adult men. It challenges the expectations that investigators are trained to rely on, forcing them to question their own assumptions. Some dismiss it initially, suggesting that witnesses may have misinterpreted what they saw, that the presence of a woman does not necessarily indicate involvement in the violence itself. Others take it more seriously, recognizing that patterns do not always conform to expectations. This division creates friction within the investigation. Resources are finite, and every direction pursued means another is delayed. Some detectives focus on known offenders in the area, individuals with histories of violent crime who fit a more traditional profile. They are questioned, their movements examined, their alibis tested. But one by one, these leads fall apart, each one a dead end that consumes time without bringing the case closer to resolution. Meanwhile, the possibility of a transient offender complicates everything further. Someone who does not stay in one place, who moves between locations without leaving a consistent trail, is inherently more difficult to track. Florida's highways, with their constant flow of traffic and people, provide the perfect environment for someone like this to operate without drawing attention. The investigation begins to feel like a race against something that cannot be seen directly. Every new piece of evidence raises as many questions as it answers. The timeline expands, stretching across months, across multiple jurisdictions, each with its own procedures, its own limitations. coordination becomes a challenge, communication a necessity that is not always as smooth as it needs to be. And then there is the issue of perception. Cases like this do not always receive immediate, sustained attention. The victims, though important, do not always fit the profile that generates widespread media coverage. Some lived on the margins, their lives less visible to the public, their disappearance is less likely to trigger immediate alarm. This affects the pace of the investigation in subtle but significant ways, influencing how resources are allocated and how urgency is perceived. But within the investigative teams, the urgency is very real. Each new body discovered reinforces the understanding that the pattern is ongoing. That whatever is driving these events has not stopped. That somewhere, beyond the reach of current evidence, the person responsible is still moving, still making decisions that will lead to more violence if not interrupted. This realization shifts the tone of the investigation. It is no longer just about solving what has already happened. It is about preventing what might happen next. Efforts begin to focus more narrowly on identifying common threads that might lead to a suspect. The vehicles associated with the victims are re-examined, their movements traced as far as possible. In some cases, they are found abandoned in locations that suggest deliberate placement rather than random disposal. This indicates a level of awareness, an understanding of how to avoid immediate detection. Investigators also begin to look more closely at the possibility that the perpetrator is not acting alone in the broader sense, not in the commission of the crimes themselves, but in the context of their daily life. Someone who interacts with others, who may have relationships that provide support, cover, or simply a sense of normalcy that allows them to continue without raising suspicion. This line of thinking leads to new avenues of inquiry, but also new complications. Relationships are difficult to map, especially when they exist within transient communities where names, identities, and locations shift frequently. As the investigation deepens, frustration begins to build. Not the kind that leads to rash decisions, but the kind that lingers beneath the surface, a constant reminder of how close they might be to understanding what is happening, and how far they still are from proving it. There are moments where it feels like the case is about to break open, where a piece of information seems to align perfectly with the existing pattern, only to collapse under closer scrutiny. Leads that appear promising at first glance dissolve into ambiguity, leaving behind only the sense that something important was just missed. But patterns, once established, have a way of tightening. The repeated references to a woman, the consistent method of the killings, the movement of vehicles, the selection of locations, all of these elements continue to point in the same direction, even if that direction does not yet lead to a name. Investigators begin to trust the pattern even as they struggle to define it completely. They adjust their approach, focusing less on fitting the case into existing frameworks and more on allowing the evidence to guide them, even if it leads somewhere unexpected. Because somewhere within that pattern, within the repetition and the subtle variations, there is a point of vulnerability. A moment where the person responsible made a mistake, left something behind, interacted with someone who remembered just enough to matter. They just haven't found it yet. And until they do, the case remains open, unresolved, moving forward with a quiet intensity that reflects the stakes involved. Lives have already been lost. Families are waiting for answers. And somewhere, beyond the reach of current understanding, the sequence that began on those dark stretches of highway is still incomplete. The question is not whether it will continue. The question is how long it will take before the investigation catches up to it. Breakthroughs in cases like this rarely arrive with certainty. They do not announce themselves as solutions, nor do they immediately resolve the chaos that precedes them. Instead, they begin as something small, almost unremarkable, a detail that stands out just enough to resist being ignored. In this investigation, that detail does not come from a crime scene, not from forensic analysis or a dramatic discovery hidden in plain sight. It comes from movement. From a vehicle that does not belong where it is, from a trace of continuity in a case defined by fragmentation. One of the victim's cars, reported missing, is eventually located. Not where the body was found, not in any place directly connected to the initial investigation, but somewhere removed, as if it had been carried forward along the same invisible path that defined the crimes themselves. The vehicle, once examined, becomes more than just a piece of evidence. It becomes a bridge between what is known and what is still hidden. Inside, there are signs of use that extend beyond the victim. Adjustments to the seat. Items that do not belong. Subtle indications that someone else has occupied this space after the violence ended. Investigators move carefully, aware that this could be the first real point of contact with the person they have been trying to identify for months. Fingerprints are lifted, catalogued, compared. Most lead nowhere, as expected. Transient environments produce transient evidence, fragments of contact that rarely lead to definitive conclusions. But then, one print does not disappear into the database. It lingers. It connects. A name begins to surface. At first, it is just that, a name among many, not yet weighted with certainty. But as investigators begin to follow it, to trace its connections, it starts to align with the pattern in ways that are difficult to dismiss. The name leads to a person who exists on the margins, someone whose life intersects with the same spaces that define the case: highways, motels, temporary residences, places where identities blur and permanence is rare. Eileen Wuornos. The name does not immediately solve the case. If anything, it complicates it further. Because the person it belongs to does not fit the profile that many investigators had been working with. A woman. A drifter. Someone who survives through means that place her in close proximity to the very men who have become victims. The pieces begin to shift. Investigators revisit witness statements, this time with a new lens. The vague descriptions of a woman seen near vehicles, the fleeting interactions remembered by those who did not realize their significance at the time, these details take on new weight. What once seemed like background noise now feels like a signal that was always there, waiting to be recognized. But a name alone is not enough. They need more. Confirmation. A way to connect this person not just to a single piece of evidence, but to the broader pattern that defines the case. And that connection does not come easily. Tracking Eileen Wuornos proves difficult. She does not have a fixed address, does not operate within systems that leave clear, traceable records. Her life is fluid, shaped by movement and necessity. She appears in one place, then disappears into another, leaving behind only fragments that suggest where she might have been. This is where the investigation takes a critical turn. Because Eileen is not entirely alone. Another name begins to surface alongside hers, one that has appeared quietly in the background of her movements. Tyria Moore. Unlike Eileen, Tyria represents a point of stability, however fragile. She is someone who can be found, someone who exists within a slightly more structured reality, making her a potential link to the person investigators are trying to reach. Finding Tyria becomes a priority. When they do, the approach is careful, deliberate. She is not treated as a suspect in the traditional sense, but as someone who may hold information, whether she realizes its significance or not. The conversation begins cautiously, questions framed in a way that allows for cooperation rather than resistance. At first, there is hesitation. Tyria's connection to Eileen is not casual. It carries emotional weight, a bond formed in circumstances that are not easily explained to outsiders. Loyalty, fear, confusion, these elements intertwine, making it difficult for her to fully engage with what investigators are suggesting. But as the conversation continues, as the details of the case are laid out, something begins to shift. Recognition. Not necessarily of guilt, not in a way that is immediately articulated, but of proximity. Of understanding that the person she knows has been moving through the same spaces, at the same times, in ways that align too closely with what investigators have uncovered. The pressure builds, not through force, but through clarity. The evidence is presented not as accusation, but as a pattern that is becoming impossible to ignore. And in that space, between denial and acceptance, Tyria makes a decision. She cooperates. This cooperation does not come easily, and it does not come without consequence. It requires her to step outside of the relationship that has defined her recent life, to view it from a perspective that is both unfamiliar and deeply uncomfortable. But it also provides investigators with something they have not had until this point: access. Through Tyria, they begin to establish communication. The plan is precise, controlled. She will reach out to Eileen, initiate contact in a way that feels natural, unforced. The goal is not confrontation, but connection, a conversation that can be monitored, guided, used to gather the information needed to move forward. When the call is made, there is a tension that fills the room. Every word matters, every pause, every shift in tone. Eileen's voice on the other end is familiar to Tyria, but now it carries a different weight. It is no longer just the voice of someone she knows. It is the voice of someone who may hold the answers to a series of violent acts that have remained unresolved for too long. The conversation unfolds carefully. At first, it is guarded. Eileen does not immediately reveal anything, her words measured, her tone controlled. But as the exchange continues, as Tyria navigates the conversation with a mixture of familiarity and subtle direction, cracks begin to appear. Hints. Admissions that are not framed as confessions, but as explanations. Fragments of truth that align with what investigators already suspect, filling in gaps that had previously remained empty. It is not a single moment that changes everything. It is a gradual accumulation, a series of statements that, when taken together, form a picture that is no longer ambiguous. The breakthrough is complete. From that point forward, the investigation moves with a different kind of momentum. The uncertainty that once defined it begins to recede, replaced by a growing sense of clarity. They know who they are looking for. They understand, at least in part, how the crimes were carried out. What remains is to bring it to an end. The arrest does not happen in a dramatic confrontation. It is controlled, calculated, designed to minimize risk and ensure that the person at the center of it all cannot slip away again. When it happens, it is almost quiet in its execution, a stark contrast to the violence that led up to it. Eileen Wuornos is taken into custody. And with that, the focus of the case shifts once more. From searching to understanding. From identifying to proving. From the uncertainty of the unknown to the complexity of what comes next. Because capturing someone is only part of the process. What follows will require unraveling not just what happened, but why. And in this case, that question may prove to be the most difficult of all. The courtroom does not feel like the highways where everything began. There is no endless horizon here, no shadows stretching across empty land, no sense of isolation. Instead, there are walls, fixed and unmoving, holding everything in place. Every movement is observed, every word recorded, every silence carrying weight. It is a space designed not for ambiguity, but for resolution, even if that resolution is built from imperfect truths. When Eileen Wuornos is brought into that space, the contrast is immediate. The woman who once moved through transient places, through roads and motels and shifting identities, is now confined to a single seat, her presence no longer fleeting but fixed under the scrutiny of the law. There is no movement here without permission, no escape into the anonymity that once defined her existence. The trial does not begin with answers. It begins with competing narratives. On one side, the prosecution builds a case grounded in pattern, in repetition, in the consistency of actions that suggest intent rather than accident. They present the victims not as isolated individuals, but as part of a sequence, each one connected by method, by circumstance, by the deliberate choices made in those final moments. The evidence is laid out piece by piece, not in dramatic bursts, but in a steady accumulation that leaves little room for coincidence. Photographs are introduced, each one capturing a moment that cannot be undone. Crime scene images, forensic details, the physical reality of what happened in those secluded spaces. The wounds, the positioning of the bodies, the absence of signs that would support prolonged struggle. These are not abstract concepts. They are tangible, visible, difficult to dismiss. Witnesses take the stand, their voices carrying fragments of the larger story. Investigators describe the process, the connections, the gradual realization that these cases were not separate. Forensic experts explain the evidence in precise terms, translating physical details into conclusions that the court can understand. Each testimony adds another layer, reinforcing the idea that what happened was not random, not reactive, but part of something structured. Then there is the matter of possession. The vehicles, the belongings taken from the victims, the evidence that places Eileen in proximity to each incident. These are not emotional arguments. They are factual, grounded in documentation, in records that do not shift or change under pressure. But the defense does not challenge the facts by denying their existence. Instead, they challenge their meaning. Their narrative is built on context, on the life that led Eileen to those highways, to those encounters, to those moments where decisions were made under conditions that most people in the courtroom have never experienced. They do not argue that the shootings did not happen. They argue that they happened for a reason that changes their nature. Self-defense. The word carries weight, but it also requires belief. The defense presents Eileen not as a predator, but as someone who has spent her life navigating danger, someone conditioned to expect violence, to anticipate it, to respond to it before it fully manifests. They describe a pattern not of calculated attacks, but of repeated threats, of situations where the balance of power shifted suddenly and left her with no perceived option but to act. Eileen herself becomes central to this narrative. When she speaks, the courtroom changes. Her words are not always consistent, not always aligned with the structure that the legal process demands. At times, she appears certain, her voice steady as she describes encounters that she insists turned violent, moments where she claims she was forced into action. She speaks of fear, of men who became threatening, of situations that escalated beyond her control. But then there are other moments. Moments where her tone shifts, where certainty gives way to something less defined. Her statements become fragmented, her focus drifting. She speaks of things that do not align with the evidence, of perceptions that seem disconnected from the reality presented by the prosecution. There are references to being watched, to forces beyond the immediate circumstances of the case, ideas that introduce a layer of instability that neither side can fully ignore. The jury watches, listens, evaluates. They are not just processing evidence. They are processing a person, one whose presence complicates the narrative in ways that are difficult to resolve. Is she a victim who became violent out of necessity, shaped by a lifetime of trauma and forced into impossible situations? Or is she someone who used that history as a framework to justify actions that were, at their core, deliberate and controlled? The prosecution returns to the consistency of the acts. The number of shots fired. The absence of injuries that would suggest prolonged struggle. The pattern of taking belongings, of using vehicles, of moving from one incident to the next without interruption. These details, they argue, do not align with spontaneous self-defense. They align with intention. The defense counters with the unpredictability of human behavior under threat. They argue that fear does not follow a script, that responses to danger are not always measured or proportional. They emphasize Eileen's past, the experiences that shaped her perception of risk, suggesting that what may appear excessive to an outside observer could have felt necessary in the moment. The courtroom becomes a space where two versions of reality coexist, each supported by evidence, each incomplete in its own way. As the trial progresses, the tension builds not through sudden revelations, but through accumulation. Each piece of testimony, each argument, each moment where Eileen's own words either align with or diverge from the evidence adds to the weight the jury must carry. There is no single turning point, no moment where everything becomes clear. Instead, there is a gradual narrowing of possibilities, a process of elimination that leads toward a conclusion that must be reached, even if it does not resolve every question. When the verdict comes, it does not arrive with relief. It arrives with finality. Guilty. The word settles into the room, heavy and unyielding. It is the legal conclusion, the answer to the question of responsibility. But it does not erase the complexity that led to this moment. It does not simplify the contradictions, the overlapping narratives, the unresolved elements that remain beneath the surface. The sentencing follows, another step in a process designed to bring closure, even if closure is never complete. Death. The sentence is delivered in the same measured tone as everything else in the courtroom, but its impact is anything but measured. It is absolute, irreversible, a decision that extends beyond the events themselves into the realm of consequence. It reflects not just the acts committed, but the interpretation of those acts, the conclusion that they were not justified, not excusable under the law. Eileen Wuornos reacts, but not in a way that fits neatly into expectation. There are moments of defiance, moments where she rejects the narrative that has been constructed around her, insisting on her version of events, holding on to the belief that what she did was necessary. And there are moments where that certainty seems to waver, where the weight of what has happened presses in from all sides. For the families of the victims, the verdict and the sentence bring a form of resolution, but not necessarily peace. Justice, in this context, is defined by accountability, by the acknowledgement that what happened to their loved ones was not acceptable, not without consequence. But it does not restore what was lost. It does not answer every question. The courtroom empties eventually, as all courtrooms do. The people who filled it return to their lives, carrying with them the memory of what they witnessed, the details of a case that will not easily fade. The structure remains unchanged, ready to hold the next set of arguments, the next attempt to impose order on events that resist simple explanation. And Eileen is taken away, no longer a figure on the roadside, no longer a presence moving through the night, but a person defined by a verdict, by a sentence, by a system that has reached its conclusion. But conclusions in cases like this are rarely as clean as they appear. Because even as the legal process comes to an end, the questions that surround it do not disappear. They linger, unresolved, carried forward by those who continue to examine what happened, who continue to ask not just what, but why. And in that space between answers and uncertainty, the story continues, even after the final judgment has been delivered. The highways are still there. They stretch across Florida just as they always have, cutting through heat and distance, carrying people from one place to another with quiet indifference. Cars still move along them at night, headlights carving narrow paths through the darkness, drivers focused on destinations that feel certain, predictable. If you were to stand at the edge of one of those roads now, you would see nothing that suggests what once unfolded there. No markers. No visible scars. Just the steady rhythm of motion, uninterrupted. And yet, for those who know the story, the landscape is no longer neutral. It holds memory. Not in a way that can be seen or touched, but in a way that lingers beneath the surface, shaping how those stretches of road are understood. Each mile carries with it the echo of decisions made in seconds, of encounters that began with something ordinary and ended with something final. The physical world moves on, but the meaning attached to it does not fade as easily. After the trial, after the verdict, after the sentence has been delivered, there is a natural expectation that the story has reached its conclusion. The system has done what it was designed to do. Responsibility has been assigned. Consequences have been enforced. In a legal sense, the case is closed. But closure is not the same as understanding. For the families of the victims, the passage of time does not erase the absence left behind. It changes its shape, perhaps, softens some of its sharper edges, but it does not remove it. There are still questions that linger, not about who was responsible, but about the moments that can never be fully reconstructed. What were the final words spoken? Was there a moment of realization, a second where everything shifted from ordinary to irreversible? These are questions that have no answers, because the only person who could provide them is bound to her own version of events, one that has never fully aligned with the evidence left behind. For some, the verdict brings a measure of stability, a sense that the world has been corrected in some way, that the imbalance created by those acts has been addressed. For others, it feels incomplete, a resolution that exists on paper but does not fully translate into emotional closure. Justice, in cases like this, is often defined by what can be proven, not by what can be felt. And then there is the figure at the center of it all. Eileen Wuornos does not disappear after the trial. She remains, confined within a system that now defines the boundaries of her existence. In the years that follow, her story continues to evolve, not through actions on the outside, but through the words she chooses to share, the statements she makes, the way she frames what she did and why. There are moments where she maintains her original narrative, insisting that each act of violence was a response to a threat, that she was placed in situations where survival required immediate, decisive action. In these moments, she presents herself as someone who acted out of necessity, shaped by a lifetime of experiences that taught her to expect danger, to respond to it without hesitation. But there are other moments. moments where her statements shift, where clarity gives way to something more fragmented. She speaks of being watched, of forces that extend beyond the physical reality of her situation, of ideas that suggest a mind struggling to maintain a consistent narrative. These contradictions do not provide resolution. They deepen the complexity, reinforcing the sense that this story cannot be reduced to a single explanation. In 2002, the sentence that had been handed down years earlier is carried out. The process is clinical, controlled, designed to be final. There is no spectacle, no dramatic conclusion that mirrors the intensity of the events that led to this point. Just a sequence of actions that bring a life to an end under the authority of the state. With that, the case reaches its official endpoint. But stories like this do not end cleanly. They persist in different forms, carried forward by those who continue to examine them, to analyze the details, to search for meaning in the overlap between circumstance and choice. The case becomes part of a larger conversation, one that extends beyond the specifics of what happened and into broader questions about violence, about trauma, about the ways in which people are shaped by the environments they move through. One of the most unsettling aspects of this story is the tension that runs through it from beginning to end. The coexistence of two realities that refuse to fully reconcile. On one side, there is the undeniable fact of what was done, the lives that were taken, the pattern of behavior that points toward intention and control. On the other, there is the life that preceded those actions, the experiences that shape perception, the possibility that the line between victim and perpetrator is not always as clear as it appears from a distance. This tension does not excuse what happened. It does not diminish the harm or the loss. But it complicates the narrative in ways that resist simple categorization. For those who study cases like this, who look beyond the surface in search of deeper understanding, Aileen Wuornos represents a convergence of factors that rarely align so visibly. Trauma, isolation, survival, control, each of these elements plays a role, but none of them alone can fully explain the outcome. It is in their interaction, in the way they build on each other over time, that the story takes shape. And even then, there are gaps. There are always gaps. Perhaps that is what lingers most after everything else has been resolved. Not just the memory of what happened, but the awareness of how much remains uncertain. How many moments existed where a different choice might have led to a different outcome? How many factors, seen and unseen, contributed to the path that ultimately unfolded? The highways do not answer these questions. They remain what they have always been, pathways through a landscape that holds both movement and stillness, connection and isolation. People continue to travel them, to make decisions without fully considering the weight those decisions might carry. Most of the time, those choices lead exactly where they are expected to go. But sometimes, they do not. And it is in those moments, rare but irreversible, that stories like this are born. Not as isolated events, but as reflections of something deeper, something that exists within the spaces between certainty and unpredictability, between control and vulnerability. Something that reminds us, quietly but persistently, that the line separating those states is thinner than we might like to believe. In the end, what remains is not just the story of a series of crimes, or the life of the person who committed them. It is the recognition that understanding does not always bring comfort, that answers do not always resolve the questions that matter most. And that some roads, once traveled, cannot be seen the same way again. Time has a way of smoothing the sharpest edges of even the most violent stories, but it never fully erases them. Instead, it reshapes how they are remembered, how they are told, and how they are understood. In the years after the execution of Aileen Wuornos, her name does not disappear into obscurity. It lingers, resurfacing in documentaries, in films, in conversations that try to make sense of something that resists simple explanation. What changes is not the facts, but the lens through which they are viewed. At first, the focus remains on the crimes themselves. The brutality, the pattern, the shock that a case like this continues to generate. People revisit the details, retracing the steps of the investigation, examining the evidence, the trial, the contradictions that defined her testimony. There is a certain distance in this approach, a sense that the story exists as something contained, something that happened in a specific place and time, separate from the present. But over time, that distance begins to close. The narrative shifts, not away from the violence, but deeper into the context that surrounded it. Questions that once felt secondary move closer to the center. What does it mean for someone to spend a lifetime on the margins, shaped by instability, by neglect, by repeated exposure to harm? At what point does survival begin to blur into something else, something darker, something that no longer fits within the boundaries of self-preservation? These questions do not come with clear answers, but they continue to be asked. For some, Eileen becomes a symbol of systemic failure, a person who was never given the tools or support needed to build a different life. They point to her childhood, to the abuse, the abandonment, the absence of intervention at critical moments. They see a trajectory that, while not inevitable, was heavily influenced by circumstances beyond her control. For others, this perspective feels incomplete. They return to the victims, to the lives that were ended, to the pattern of behavior that extended beyond any single moment of fear or desperation. They argue that no amount of context can fully account for the repetition, for the consistency of the acts, for the choices that were made again and again. To them, the focus must remain on accountability, on the recognition that understanding is not the same as justification. These perspectives do not cancel each other out. They exist side by side, creating a tension that mirrors the one present throughout the case itself. This tension becomes part of the story's legacy. It is reflected in the way it is retold, in the way different versions emphasize different elements, shaping how new audiences encounter it for the first time. In some retellings, the emphasis is on the psychological complexity, the internal conflict, the blurred lines between victimhood and agency. In others, the focus is sharper, more direct, centered on the acts themselves and their impact. Neither approach is entirely complete on its own. Because what makes this story endure is not just what happened, but how difficult it is to define it in absolute terms. There is also something else that lingers, something less discussed but equally important. The role of chance. So many elements of this case hinge on moments that could have gone differently. A car that stops instead of continuing. A road chosen instead of another. A piece of evidence found rather than overlooked. A conversation that leads to cooperation rather than silence. These moments, individually small, collectively shape the outcome in ways that are impossible to predict in advance. It is tempting to look back and see a clear path, to believe that events unfolded in a way that was always leading to this conclusion. But that clarity is an illusion created by hindsight. In reality, the path was uncertain at every step, shaped by decisions made without full knowledge of their consequences. That uncertainty is what makes the story unsettling even after it has ended. Because it suggests that the line between ordinary life and irreversible tragedy is not as distant as it might seem. That the same roads, the same decisions, the same fleeting interactions continue to exist, unchanged in their structure, even if the specific circumstances are different. And yet, there is also a need to move forward. For the families, for the investigators, for the communities touched by these events, the passage of time brings with it a gradual shift. The case becomes part of the past, not forgotten, but integrated into a broader narrative of experience. It becomes something that shaped them, that influenced how they see the world, but not something that defines every moment moving forward. For those who study cases like this, who analyze patterns of behavior, psychological profiles, systemic influences, the story remains a point of reference. A complex example that challenges assumptions, that resists easy categorization, that forces a deeper examination of how multiple factors can converge into something destructive. And for those who encounter it as a story, removed from the direct impact, it becomes something else again. A reflection. A question. A reminder. Not just of what happened, but of how it happened. Of how ordinary moments can carry hidden weight. Of how perception can shape reality in ways that are not always aligned with truth. Of how control, once taken, can alter the course of events in ways that cannot be undone. In the end, there is no single message that emerges from all of this. There is no clean moral, no simple conclusion that resolves the complexity into something easily understood. What remains instead is a series of impressions, of questions that continue to echo long after the details have been absorbed. The image of a road at night. A car slowing. A decision made without fully understanding its consequences. A life shaped by forces both visible and unseen, moving through a world that offered both opportunity and danger in equal measure. And the recognition that, sometimes, the most unsettling stories are not the ones that are hardest to understand, but the ones that feel just close enough to reality that they cannot be dismissed as something entirely separate. Because they are not separate. They are part of the same world, the same roads, the same quiet moments where everything can change. And once you see that clearly, even for a second, it becomes impossible to look away completely. There is a moment, long after the headlines fade and the courtroom's empty, when a story like this begins to settle into something quieter, something less immediate but no less powerful. It is no longer driven by urgency or shock, but by reflection. By the slow, deliberate process of looking back and asking what, if anything, can be understood from the pieces that remain. The case of Eileen Wuornos does not lend itself easily to that kind of reflection. It resists simplification at every turn. The facts are clear in their structure, the sequence of events well documented, the outcome legally resolved. And yet, when viewed as a whole, the story continues to feel incomplete, as though something essential exists just beyond the reach of what can be proven or explained. Part of that unease comes from the way the narrative forces a confrontation with uncomfortable realities. Not just about violence, but about the conditions that allow it to take shape. It asks questions about responsibility that do not have clean boundaries, about how much of a person's actions can be traced back to their experiences, and where the line must ultimately be drawn. It is easy, from a distance, to categorize. To assign labels that create a sense of order. Killer. Victim. Innocent. Guilty. These words serve a purpose, providing a framework through which events can be understood quickly and decisively. But in this case, those labels feel insufficient on their own. Because the person at the center of it all lived a life that does not fit neatly into any single category. Before the crimes, before the investigation, before the trial, there was a series of experiences that shaped how she saw the world and her place within it. Experiences that involved abandonment, exploitation, survival in environments where trust was not a given but a risk. These are not just background details. They are part of the foundation upon which everything else was built. And yet, acknowledging that foundation does not change what followed. The acts themselves remain, fixed in their impact, unaffected by the context that surrounds them. Lives were taken. Families were altered in ways that cannot be reversed. The consequences extend outward, touching people who had no direct connection to the events but who are nonetheless shaped by their aftermath. This duality is what makes the case so difficult to resolve on a deeper level. It requires holding two truths at the same time, without allowing one to erase the other. That someone can be both shaped by harm and responsible for causing it. That understanding the path that led to violence does not excuse the violence itself. For those who study criminal behavior, this case becomes a point of reference not because it provides clear answers, but because it highlights the limitations of existing frameworks. It challenges assumptions about gender, about patterns, about what a perpetrator is supposed to look like or how they are supposed to act. It forces a reconsideration of how certain cases are approached, how biases can influence the direction of an investigation, how expectations can delay recognition of what is actually happening. There is also the question of perception. Throughout the case, perception plays a critical role, not just in how the events unfold, but in how they are later interpreted. The perception of the victims in their final moments, the perception of threat or safety, the perception of control within a confined space. And later, the perception of the public, shaped by media, by retellings, by the framing of the story in ways that emphasize certain elements over others. These layers of perception create a narrative that is not fixed, but evolving. Over time, new perspectives emerge, new interpretations take hold, and the story is revisited through different lenses. Some focus on the psychological aspects, attempting to understand the internal mechanisms that drove the behavior. Others focus on the systemic issues, examining how failures at multiple levels may have contributed to the outcome. Still others return to the evidence itself, looking for clarity in the details that remain unchanged. Each of these approaches adds something to the overall understanding, but none of them fully resolves the tension at the heart of the case. Perhaps that is what makes it endure. Not the shock of the crimes, not the notoriety of the individual, but the unresolved space between explanation and accountability. The recognition that some stories cannot be fully contained within a single narrative, that they require a willingness to sit with uncertainty, to accept that not every question will have a satisfying answer. There is also a quieter aspect to this reflection, one that often goes unnoticed. The way in which cases like this influence behavior, even in subtle ways. The awareness that develops around certain situations, the hesitation that might not have existed before, the small adjustments people make without fully realizing why. A driver might think twice before stopping on a dark stretch of road. A conversation between strangers might carry a different weight. These are not dramatic changes, but they are real, shaped by the accumulation of stories that alter how risk is perceived. In this way, the impact of the case extends beyond those directly involved. It becomes part of a broader cultural understanding, a reference point that informs how certain scenarios are viewed, how certain decisions are made. It does not dominate that understanding, but it contributes to it, adding another layer to the complex way in which people navigate the world. And still, the questions remain. Not just about what happened, but about what it means. About how to reconcile the different elements of the story without reducing it to something simpler than it is. About how to acknowledge both the humanity and the harm, without allowing one to overshadow the other. These are not questions that can be answered definitively. They are questions that continue to be asked, in different forms, by different people, each bringing their own perspective, their own framework for understanding. And in that ongoing process, the story remains alive, not as an active case, but as a point of reflection that resists being fully resolved. The highways continue to stretch across the landscape, unchanged in their form. The courtrooms continue to function, processing new cases, new narratives, new attempts to impose order on events that often defy it. Life continues, as it always does, moving forward without pausing for any single story, no matter how significant. But for those who look back, who take the time to examine what happened and why, there is something that lingers. A recognition of complexity. A reminder that understanding is not always about reaching a conclusion, but about engaging with the questions that remain when the conclusion has already been reached. And in that space, between what is known and what is still uncertain, the story of Eileen Wuornos continues to exist, not as a closed chapter, but as an ongoing reflection on the fragile boundaries that define human behavior. In the end, what lingers is not just the story itself, but the silence that follows it. Not an empty silence, but one filled with the weight of everything that has already happened, everything that cannot be undone. It exists in the spaces between words, between memories, between the versions of events that never fully align. It is the kind of silence that does not demand attention, but once noticed, refuses to disappear. The case of Eileen Wuornos settles into that silence. No longer unfolding, no longer active, but not entirely at rest either. There is a tendency, when looking back on something like this, to search for a final perspective, a way to bring all the elements together into something that feels complete. A lesson, perhaps. A clear takeaway that justifies the act of revisiting the story at all. But the truth is, not every story offers that kind of resolution. Some remain open, not in the sense that the facts are unknown, but in the sense that their meaning continues to shift depending on how they are viewed. This is one of those stories. It is a story about violence, undeniably. About lives that ended abruptly, without warning, in moments that began like any other. It is a story about a person who committed those acts, who moved through a world shaped by instability and found, at some point, a way to exert control that came at the ultimate cost to others. But it is also a story about everything that came before that point. About a life that unfolded without the structures that most people rely on, without consistent protection, without the kind of intervention that might have altered its course. It is about the accumulation of experiences that shape perception, that influence how situations are interpreted, how threats are identified, how responses are formed. These elements do not exist separately. They overlap, intersect, reinforce each other in ways that are not always visible until something irreversible happens. And when that happens, the focus narrows. It moves to the act itself, to the evidence, to the process of determining responsibility. This is necessary. It is how systems function, how accountability is established. But in that narrowing, something is inevitably left behind. The broader context, the complexity, the factors that do not fit neatly into legal definitions but are nonetheless part of the reality. The challenge, then, is not to choose one perspective over the other, but to hold both at the same time. To recognize the harm without minimizing it, to acknowledge the context without allowing it to become an excuse. To understand that a person can be shaped by forces beyond their control and still be responsible for the choices they make within that framework. This is not a comfortable position. It requires a willingness to sit with contradiction, to accept that clarity is not always complete, that understanding does not always lead to resolution. But it is perhaps the only way to engage with a story like this honestly, without reducing it to something simpler than it is. There is also something else that remains, something quieter but no less significant. The awareness of how close the ordinary can be to the extraordinary, how easily one can become the other under the right conditions. The roads where these events took place are not inherently different from any others. The interactions that led to those final moments are not unique in their structure. They are variations of encounters that happen every day, in countless places, without consequence. And yet, in this case, they led somewhere else. That is what makes the story difficult to dismiss. Not because it is incomprehensible, but because it is recognizable in its basic form. Because it exists within the same world, the same patterns of movement and decision-making that define everyday life. It is not separate. It is not entirely removed. It is part of the same reality. That realization does not mean that the same outcome is likely, or even common. It is not about creating fear, or suggesting that every moment carries hidden danger. It is about acknowledging that the potential for divergence exists, that under certain conditions, paths can shift in ways that are not immediately visible. And once that shift happens, it cannot be reversed. For those who continue to examine cases like this, who look for patterns, for explanations, for ways to prevent similar events in the future, this awareness becomes part of a larger effort. Not to eliminate risk entirely, which is impossible, but to understand it more clearly, to recognize the factors that contribute to it, to identify points where intervention might make a difference. These efforts do not erase what has already happened. But they are a way of responding to it, of ensuring that the story does not exist only as something to be remembered, but also as something to be learned from, even if the lessons are not simple or easily defined. And for those who encounter the story as listeners, as observers, as people trying to make sense of something that exists outside their direct experience, there is a different kind of engagement. One that is less about answers and more about awareness. About recognizing the complexity of human behavior, the ways in which environment and experience shape perception, the importance of understanding without losing sight of accountability. About accepting that some stories will always carry elements that resist full explanation, that remain unresolved not because the facts are missing, but because the meaning is not fixed. In that sense, the story does not end here. It changes form, moving from event to reflection, from immediate reality to something that exists in memory and interpretation. It becomes part of a broader conversation, one that continues in different ways, through different voices, each adding something to the ongoing effort to understand. And perhaps that is the closest thing to an ending that a story like this can have. Not a conclusion, but a continuation. A recognition that what happened cannot be undone, but can still be examined, still be questioned, still be used as a point of reference for understanding the fragile, complicated nature of the world we move through. The silence remains, but it is no longer empty. It carries the story with it. And for those willing to listen closely enough, it always will. There is a point, long after everything has been told and retold, when a story stops being just a sequence of events and becomes something else entirely. It turns into a mirror. Not a perfect one, not something that reflects clearly or comfortably, but something that reveals fragments of reality that are often easier to ignore than confront. The story of Eileen Wuornos becomes that kind of mirror. Not because it is unique in its violence, but because of how it unsettles the boundaries people rely on to make sense of violence in the first place. It challenges the instinct to separate the world into clear categories, to believe that danger has a recognizable face, that harm comes from places that can be easily identified and avoided. In this case, those assumptions fail. The danger did not arrive in a form that fit expectations. It did not present itself in a way that would have immediately triggered alarm. It existed within ordinary interactions, within moments that felt familiar enough to proceed without hesitation. And that familiarity is what makes the story linger, even after every detail has been examined. Because it forces a question that is difficult to answer without discomfort. How often do we rely on assumptions to guide our decisions? How often do we move through situations believing we understand them, believing we are in control, without fully recognizing the variables at play? The men who became victims in this story were not acting irrationally in the context of their environment. Their decisions were shaped by patterns that had likely worked before, by experiences that reinforced a sense of predictability. The roads were familiar. The interactions, while not entirely without risk, were not outside the realm of what they had encountered previously. And yet, those same patterns led them into something entirely different. This is not a judgment. It is an observation. An acknowledgement that human behavior is often guided by repetition, by the expectation that what has happened before will continue to happen in the same way. Most of the time, that expectation holds. It allows life to function, to move forward without constant hesitation or fear. But sometimes, it does not. And when it breaks, it does so without warning. For Eileen, the same principle applies, but in a different direction. Her understanding of the world was shaped by a set of experiences that reinforced a different kind of expectation. One where danger was not occasional, but constant. Where trust was not a default, but a risk. Where survival required anticipation, sometimes even preemption. If that perception becomes ingrained deeply enough, it begins to alter how situations are interpreted. Ambiguity becomes threat. Uncertainty becomes danger. And in that shift, the threshold for action changes. Again, this does not justify what happened. But it provides a framework for understanding how two people can enter the same situation with entirely different perceptions of what is unfolding. One may see a transaction, something controlled and predictable. The other may see a potential threat, something that must be addressed immediately, decisively. When those perceptions collide, the outcome can be catastrophic. This is where the story moves beyond its specific details and into something more universal. Not in the sense that it happens often, but in the sense that it reveals something fundamental about how people navigate the world. How perception shapes reality, how experience influences interpretation, how the same moment can hold entirely different meanings depending on who is experiencing it. It also raises questions about intervention. At what point could something have changed? Where, within the sequence of events that led to this outcome, might a different action have altered the trajectory? These questions are not about assigning blame beyond what has already been established. They are about understanding the complexity of causation, the way multiple factors align over time to produce a result that, in hindsight, feels both inevitable and preventable. There is no single answer. The story does not offer a clear moment where everything could have been stopped, a single decision that, if reversed, would have erased what followed. Instead, it presents a series of points, each one a potential divergence, each one connected to the others in ways that are not always obvious. This is what makes prevention so difficult. It is not about identifying one cause and addressing it. It is about recognizing patterns, understanding environments, acknowledging the ways in which vulnerability and opportunity can intersect in unpredictable ways. It requires a level of awareness that extends beyond individual actions into broader systems, into the structures that shape how people live, how they interact, how they respond to the world around them. And even then, there are no guarantees. Because human behavior is not static. It evolves, adapts, shifts in response to circumstances that cannot always be anticipated. What can be understood in one context may not apply in another. What works as a safeguard in one situation may fail in the next. This uncertainty is not a flaw in the system. It is a reflection of the complexity of the world itself. For those who engage with this story, whether as analysts, storytellers, or simply as listeners trying to make sense of it, there is a responsibility that comes with that engagement. Not to resolve the story into something neat or comforting, but to respect its complexity, to resist the urge to simplify it in ways that erase its most important elements. That means holding on to the contradictions. Recognizing that a person can be both shaped by harm and responsible for causing it. That a situation can be both ordinary in its structure and extraordinary in its outcome. That understanding something does not necessarily make it less troubling, but can, in fact, deepen the discomfort by revealing how much remains uncertain. It also means remembering the individuals at the center of it, not just as roles within a narrative, but as people whose lives extended beyond the moments that defined them in this story. The victims were more than the circumstances of their deaths. Eileen was more than the actions for which she was convicted. These identities are part of the story, but they are not the entirety of who these individuals were. Holding on to that perspective is not about diminishing the impact of what happened. It is about maintaining a sense of humanity within a story that could easily become reduced to its most extreme elements. Because when that humanity is lost, something important is lost with it. The ability to see the full scope of what the story represents. And perhaps that is the final layer of this reflection. Not a conclusion, not a resolution, but a reminder. That stories like this exist within the same world we all move through. That they are shaped by factors that are, in many ways, familiar, even if their outcomes are not. That understanding them requires more than just attention to detail, but a willingness to engage with complexity, to sit with uncertainty, to accept that some questions will remain open. The mirror does not provide answers. It reflects what is there, fragmented, incomplete, sometimes difficult to look at directly. But once you have seen it, even briefly, it becomes part of how you understand everything else. And that understanding, however imperfect, is what remains when the story itself has reached its end.